Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. I hope it's as nice where you are as it is here. It is August 16th, 2020, and I am so excited to welcome you all to part one of our Education and COVID broadcast, where we'll be speaking on the role and racism of public schools. My name is Jumi. I'll be your moderator today, and we are PLP, the Progressive Labor Party, a communist organization fighting to eradicate capitalism and all forms of capitalist exploitation through the revolution led by the workers, envisioning and working towards a communist future. That means a future where education and public schooling is actually equitable, unified, and universal, rather than the racist, classist, indoctrinating bullshit that we have to go through now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Education under communism is for part two. This series is part of an ongoing series of forums that PLP has hosted, all of which you can access through our YouTube channel, which will be linked below. Today's lineup, or today's agenda, consists of three main topics and a Q&A afterwards. First, we'll be giving the history or the role of education, the racist roots of public schools under capitalism. Then we'll be talking about the lose-lose situation we're faced with under COVID. And finally, we'll be talking about the fight ahead. We're going to end with a question and answer portion where all the speakers will be back up. Sorry, my mask. To answer your questions. So please put your questions in the ask box right next to the chat on your left and light up the chat throughout. Like, you guys are already doing a great job. Because we want this to be as engaging as possible, starting with, next slide, starting with these true or false questions, like why do we have free public schools in the US? Here's what we've been taught, that public schools in the US create an informed citizenry. Do you agree with that? Give me a thumbs up, a thumbs down. Give me an agree. I disagree. I know when I asked my brothers, yes, it is false. 1/3 of the adults in the United States cannot name the three branches of the government. That is false. Like, public schools do not create an informed citizenry. I literally asked my brother what the three branches of the government are. He is 16 years old. In high school right now, he could not name them. I'll give you another thing that we're told, that public schools in the US are supposed to create an equality of opportunity. Agree? Disagree? Let me hear it, or let me see it. It's false. Of course it's false. Income inequality and low life expectancy are at their highest in 50 years, and that's pre-COVID. It's cap. And lastly, Americans in the US must compete so that they can make a living. Is that true or false? It's false. The largest number of jobs in the US are held in retail sales, cashier positions, and food preparation, most of which do not require a high school diploma and are the lowest paid jobs in the US. Like, education, public schooling, all the things that we're taught that we need this for, like, it's not true. These are lies. They're pushing us with lies. And it started from that, which our next speaker, Angela, will continue talking about in the roots. Oh, here's a hidden agenda.
So thank you, Jumi. This part, the hidden agenda, you can take a look at that for yourself. This is what we think is going on, right? Capitalism uses public schools to reinforce discipline, patriotism, obedience, and passivity, working class divisions and racism, and also competition. And today I would argue that they're teaching competition through cooperation. So they want us to compete abroad, cooperate together at home so we can be competitive abroad. But again, that's only a sector of us. Next slide, please. So if we take a look at this picture, this is from Puck Magazine in 1899. And while I talk, go ahead and take a really close look at what you see on the screen. We're only really going to look at two distinct points in history of the United States, the education, because of course it would take too long to go through all of it. But if you look at this, this particular image, I'm going to hit two moments in history, and this is from one of them, from the first part of American education, when it was really starting to be broader for the general public rather than just for the elites in society. And this is very clear as to what was going on with the racism in the United States. The caption, you can't see it, it's not published there, but the caption is Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization. And he says, "Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you will feel as glad to be here as they are." So if you look at the class, of course, is sitting in the back with books, and each of those books has the name of a state in the United States. And over by the window is a little black boy washing the windows. He's not actually part of the class. By the door, if you see that, it's a stereotypical Native American or Indian with feathers. The book he's holding is actually upside down. And then at the door is a little Chinese boy, presumably a boy. So if you take a look at this, you can really see that the roots of racism are pretty deep in the United States and our education system. I went ahead and put on the side what was printed on the blackboard. And it says, "The content of the governed is a good thing in theory, but a very rare in fact." So again, social commentary on the day, talking about what was going on with the settler colonialism and how the United States was destroying cultures all around the world. Oh, and sorry, the little children in the front, you can see those are our four Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. I'm sure they felt they needed to be taught all there was to teach. The next slide. And again, I'm showing these to you to sort of hopefully spark a conversation, first of all, and second of all, so that when you think about what went on in history and what's going on today, that you connect the dots and you remember that the roots don't go away, right? We haven't cut the roots. They're still there. They're very deep. They're very racist. And they're also very much about the ruling class getting its needs met. These black and white photos, if you take a look at them and imagine if they were in color, can you imagine any scenario today that would be fairly similar? For example, the top left corner, it might not be a factory. It might be farm workers. It might be Black Lives Matter, right? The protests going out on the street. Down in the bottom right corner, I know I have a lot of students who are living in very crowded conditions, 2 or 3 families in a small 1-bedroom apartment because that's what they can afford. And they're afraid that they're going to be evicted right now. So again, our student conditions at home are their learning conditions. They were in the 1890s, and it really fundamentally hasn't changed for the working class over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one is really talking about I picked this moment in time because it has to do with industrialization in the United States. And that's when the industrialists were having quote unquote problems with the working class. So give me just a second. So the working class, of course, especially in the Northeast, where industrialization was really taking off, most of the workers were recent immigrants. They spoke lots of languages. They were growing angry about low wages, long hours, horrid living conditions and working conditions, and repetitive, boring work. Along with the rapid growth of population density in cities, the inequality was growing and was more visible. In the rural areas of the country, yes, there was tremendous inequality, but it was spread out, wasn't quite as visible. So the working class revolted, and there were numerous protests and riots. This alienation created problems for the ruling class, particularly in regards to their profits. So they needed a way to calm the working class, and one strategy was the establishment of public schools for the masses. The ruling elites believed schools would allow them to continue to profit while reducing the dangerous consequences of alienation that Marx wrote about. So how was this? Well, the big industrialists brought in this guy named Horace Mann. I know he's one person we learn about when we're learning about teaching. He was a politician and an education reformer, and he's best known for promoting universal public schooling and teacher training in what we call normal school, sort of like for the masses. And they really thought that this would help them in their profits. And the slide that you have in front of you is a quote from one of the many, I guess, industrialists of the day. And they all said very similar things. But if you read this, particularly where it's highlighted, it's going to give you a clear idea of really the foundation of modern public schools, I think. From my observation and experience, I am perfectly satisfied that the owners of manufacturing property have a deep financial interest in the education and morals of their help. And as competition becomes more close, I believe it will be seen that the establishment, meaning business, which has the best educated and most moral help, will give the greatest production at the least cost per pound. Again, they're talking about profit. They're not talking about educating the working class for the sake of the working class. They're talking about profit. Underlying all of education is the profit motive. So please think about that as you continue to think about what's going on with COVID today. And can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, and here are some additional quotes about different things that have happened in different parts of the United States a little later in the generations. A lot of you know these already. So after the Civil War, for example, in Mississippi, it was illegal to be unemployed. So it forced people to take whatever jobs they could get at whatever terms that were offered. And in Prince Edward, Virginia, the whites closed the schools rather than integrate. And they did this for 5 years where there were no public schools open. 1958, Little Rock, Arkansas, they opened schools. The Little Rock Nine did such a great job that the whites in the community and the governor closed the schools there for a year rather than integrate again. They still went to school. They went to their own little private schools, but again, not publicly funded. But the same is also true. We don't usually hear about people from other groups. Racial groups, Latinos, for example, 80% of them attended separate schools. And the last bullet in San Francisco, they had segregated schools for Chinese students, but then in 1870, they amended the law and they dropped the requirement to even educate the Chinese students entirely. So again, racist to the core. And sure, there have been some reforms over the years, and you can go to the next slide. There's always this push and pull, right? Because the capitalists are always trying to figure out ways to maximize their profits with the least amount of disruption to their system, right? So if we jump to when Obama was in office, we have to really be careful and watch what they do and not really think about what they say. When they passed the most recent changes to the Education Act, I think it was 2015, the Education Department declared this the nation's, their commitment to equal opportunity for all students, right? This bipartisan idea. Everyone was on board about it, everyone in Congress. But if you really look at what happens as a result, they can say anything they want, the proof is in the pudding. Look at the numbers and as far as how much money they're willing to put into education. For education, the federal government spends $79 billion. However, they're giving $79.3 billion in corporate tax breaks, right? We won't even talk about the military. So here again, every time you hear these things, you have to always look at what's going on underneath. Sort of what is that? You have to look at the essence of what's actually going on. And then the last slide, please. If you look historically and you look today, there really hasn't been a substantive change for the working class. Over, you can see the picture of the tenements from the 1800s on the left. And I go back again to the students that I have who are living in very crowded conditions, right? Whether they go to school or whether they don't go to school during COVID, this is the situation that they're coming with, right, when they go to school. And we always have to think about the racist roots and also the capitalist roots of education and not let them tell us otherwise. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye and pass it along to our next speaker, Adam. So go ahead, Adam, take it away with COVID.
Okay. Good to see everybody. Here I am. I hope you can. Okay, great. I see you can hear me. So I'm just going to pick up on the history. The next slide. I'm glad everyone can hear. The next slide talks about how remote versus in person is a lose-lose proposition for the working class, and there is a contradiction at the heart of U.S. capitalist education that the bosses will never be able to solve. On the one hand, they need to teach each of us that we are citizens of a democracy, but they also need to teach each of us that we are expendable. Teachers, parents, and students are trained to accept some number of dropouts, suspensions, failures, and etc. as inevitable inside of our schools. And this is a preparation for accepting some part of the adult population also as expendable, the incarcerated, the unemployed, those dead in bosses' wars, and who die from preventable disease. COVID-19, of course, has hammered home just how expendable workers are in capitalist society. All teachers know that remote learning is a degraded and degrading approximation of live instruction. Students learn less. And we're facing the prospect of a lost generation in US education, whether we go into schools or whether we stay home. This is the lose-lose that we face. But the prospect of a lost generation is a serious matter for the main wing of the US ruling class as well. They have a big contradiction on their hands. As much as their schools teach expendability, they also try to teach patriotism and citizenship, as we've just heard. Their job is to build loyalty to US capitalism, so leaving millions of teenagers, for instance, with more free time, or leaving them more free to shape their own worldview for an extended period of time, in a world that is falling apart all around us, won't turn out well for capitalists and imperialists who are preparing for war with China. On the hidden danger of keeping schools closed. The main danger of opening schools, of course, is that the ruling class has shown time and again racist disregard and incompetence when it comes to protecting the lives of workers. But a simple call to keep schools shut until it's safe comes dangerously close to making peace with the result of a lost generation of students in failing remote learning at home. It also rests on the illusion that safety is even possible under capitalism. Let's not fool ourselves. The ruling class will reopen their public schools sooner or later, and every struggle to reduce the danger in those reopenings is a place for us to be. They have to get workers back to the point of production where exploitation of labor generates the profits that are the lifeblood of their vicious system. The biggest and most dangerous ruling class elements, who Joe Biden seeks to represent, see school reopening as vital to holding on to what is left of U.S. capitalism's position as a leading world power. There's talk of vaccination. Vaccination will reduce, but not eliminate risk. And a return to school for live teaching will involve new risks. When schools do reopen, it will be the young people and families who need the support of school the most who will send their kids first. And teachers who hold to the position that no additional risk is acceptable are wading into waters made murky by the filth of racism. As communists, we must carefully keep in mind the terrible pressures on our class brothers and sisters who will send their children to school for live instruction. These workers love their kids too, no less than anyone else. But we as teachers have been inundated with decades of racist theories about, quote, broken families and cultures of poverty, which lead us to second guess the judgment of our most oppressed parents. We ought to be asking how we can help these parents, not assume that they're incompetent. Parents were making impossible choices between bad alternatives for their children before COVID-19. Some teachers need to wake up to that. And the ruling class pays some teachers just enough for us to live apart from our most oppressed students. And the longtime slogan of our unions that teachers are not workers, we're not education workers, but professionals, is another corrosive idea which divides us from our class brothers and sisters. Profound social and residential segregation mean that many of our teacher colleagues have no appreciation for what real life is like for the students we serve. Perhaps it is time for us teachers to humble ourselves and learn from the working class what capitalism is really like. And once we learn, then let us teach the truth about the society that we live in. Let us inject the content of communism into the boss's education, whatever form it may take, remote or in-school instruction. Let us make politics primary. Any call for school closure cannot be allowed to contribute to the abandonment of our class brothers and sisters, or is it a Trojan horse for capitalist individualism. Only communism can banish the profit motive from healthcare and truly put the health of entire populations first. Whereas today, of course, we have healthcare that waits for individuals to get sick and then tries to turn a quick buck. Any struggle to keep schools closed must be coupled with gestures towards working class solidarity that the coming speakers will address, or we risk that narrow teacher self-interest will become the real agenda of any job action. To be clear, the danger of school closure is that another layer of acceptable and normalized neglect will be piled on to the already callous and racist culture of capitalist schooling. Here, there are a few slides that I'd like to review, A through F, just as reminders of what's wrong with distance learning. For working parents, there are many working parents unable to supervise their children during the day because they're at work. They can't afford tutors and babysitters. B, lack of access speaks to technology. Moving to the next slide. Would be C, parent education. If parents do not understand the technology students are using, that's a problem. Letter D, the staff to student ratios are too high. It's impossible to do a good job for the numbers of students we've been assigned. And finally, points E and F, kids with difficulties will be easily ignored, and language barriers, all right? All of these are the problems with remote instruction, okay? There is a great danger for the working class now that parents and teachers will emerge from this crisis even more fractured than we went into it. That danger of COVID-19, of a working class more divided against itself, is, I will suggest, the greatest danger of all. Insensitive, militant-sounding calls to keep schools closed will backfire and undermine the cause of building working class solidarity. Communists cannot champion a tactic that undermines class consciousness. And there is a lot of fake class consciousness in the air these days. Bernie is the founder of this phenomenon most recently, and AOC and her squad are its poster children of the moment. In a nutshell, the problem with Bernie and AOC is that they are nationalists. Their program can and will be absorbed into imperialism. They represent a sort of equitable imperialism, if you will. For good news, turn to the masses, not to Congress. The widely shared sense that this quote unquote economy we have only serves the rich and isn't worth risking our lives for is a healthy one. And the fact that millions, both here and overseas, risk their health to some extent to go into the streets and to make the political statement in huge crowds that racist killer cops have got to go, that is more promising news. For a moment, anti-racist, militant, multiracial politics became primary. This kind of militancy and energy is what needs to be injected into the battle over what schooling will look like. The fight over racist school reopening and closure needs to look a lot more like the fight we saw after George Floyd was killed by racist cops. We are in for a long fight. The leadership of Black workers and Black youth will be key. There is one goal, one solution that we have to train our eyes and the eyes of our base on, and that is communism. If in closing I can part with a definition, I can't resist. If capitalism is an entire social order where the needs of capital come first, capital being wealth that is invested to generate more wealth through exploitation of workers, capital. If capitalism is a social order where the needs of capital come first, then communism is an entire social order where the needs of the commune come first. And what is the commune? It is the group of people who have made the political decision to share. Fight for communism. Let's talk about how. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Give a shout out to the comrade who just went before me. So now we're diving right into the fight ahead, right? We heard the situation, we heard the history, we heard what our political understanding and our political line and message has to be. Now we got to put it into practice. Now we have to fight. And a key part of that is building unity among teachers, students, staff, and parents. This is essential, but it is also key. We can go to the next slide. So there's this interesting book called Bound in Wedlock, and it really tells this really interesting story about what it is to be a communist, what it is to be, we can take lessons of what it is to be a communist and what it is to be a fighter. And so one of these stories in this book, there's a story of Henry Box Brown. And so Henry Box Brown was a slave that managed to become free by stuffing himself in a box and mailing himself from a plantation in Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. He had experienced many struggles and traumas that have become synonymous with racist exploitation during the period of slavery. Some of the most traumatic experiences were that of being ripped away from family and friends. As a teenager, he saw all of his siblings sold away, friends beaten and sold to other plantations. Even his wife and children were torn away from each other at the hands of racists chasing profits. These actions were the last straw that led to Henry's massive plan to get free. Despite these hardships, Henry became a free person and used his freedom to become a fighter against racism and an organizer of the destruction of slavery. But Henry didn't come to that conclusion of freedom by himself. His mother had been preparing him all of his life for a life of struggle, but also a life of resistance. When he was a young boy, she would take him upon her knee and pointing at the different trees in the forest during autumn, she would talk about how the leaves were being stripped from the trees and just blown around in multiple different directions. And she talked to him about how this was very similar to the life of slaves and their existence, that they were like those leaves being snatched from branches and blown in multiple directions. So her telling her son that story was very important, just like it is when Black mothers talk to their sons or their children about how to prepare them right for this life of racism that they will endure, how Latinx parents talk to their children about the hardships and of ICE and all of these different things, right? So also as teachers and as educators and as communists, we have to see it as our duty to prepare our students for the ills of capitalism, but also the need to fight back. We can go to the next slide. So only safety workers have ever known under capitalism. I'll repeat that section because it's very important. The only safety workers have ever known under capitalism has been found in multiracial unity and solidarity with each other to build class struggle. And so as we, as educators, as staff, as friends of educators, as parents, as we are preparing ourselves for the school year starting back up, we need to keep three things in mind to kind of set the context for what it is, what our task is to do. So we have to keep our perspective, right? Our students and their families are the priority, not the curriculum, not the data, not what your principal is talking about, right? Our students. We have to get to know our students as best as we can, right? And remember that our students who are not emotionally or physically available are not learning. And we have to build community with our students. Start on a plan for those students who don't show up, and make sure we build a community in our classrooms, in our schools, call home to parents, talk with them, but also build a culture of solidarity and fight back. This is a very key and crucial point. Next slide. So as other folks have been talking about the different things that have happened, I've always said, like, this has been a hell of a year. Who would have thought 2019 would have been one for the ages, right? But it's also taught us so many things, taught us so many lessons, given us examples of a different world that we can see, right? So when we think about some of the things that we've had to do during COVID, right? We've had to develop food pantries. We've had to develop health clinics. We've had to respond to people being evicted. And after George Floyd, we had to respond to racist murder, racist exploitation, and we had to do it in force, right? So if folks in the chat, we want to try to make this interactive. If folks in the chat can talk about what are some other examples of fight back, primarily around education that we've seen this year, but also if you can't get to that, what are some examples just in general of fight back that we've seen that hasn't been mentioned? And don't be shy. I know a lot of you all have a lot of good ideas in our, so don't be shy. So some of the things that I was just saying, right? Some of these different fight backs, like I said, the food pantries, different mutual aid societies that have popped up, folks responding to ICE, right? Free them all, right? Different campaigns around folks who are incarcerated, eviction struggles, the fact that, right, our schools are not safe, fighting back against reopening schools, right? Unsafe environment. Here in Chicago, the mayor has just used this period of COVID to just go on the offensive. Yeah, they could, just to go on the offensive. They're trying to do this Obama Center. She's been using the Obama Center to like gentrify and displace folks. They've been using a lot of different factories and stuff like that have been polluting the area and things. So, right, we're seeing that the bosses are on the attack, but workers have also been fighting back. We can go to the next slide. Another good one, right? Fighting for people with disabilities. Good. And so some of the things that we have to be doing, right? Some more concrete things is to find out and push back. So we need to be understanding, right? When we're in our school buildings, right? Who's supposed to be following up with certain students? What is the role of administration? We all know that administration will try to cut as many corners as possible. And like the comrade was saying before, we have to make sure that we are fighting for our students. We have to be understanding what's being proposed, right? What are the different superintendents imposing? What are the principals proposing? What are the unions proposing? We have to know the plans. Oftentimes as communists, we're seen as leaders. So we have to be known as beacons of information. creating and teaching relevant curriculum that reflect the times, right? So when COVID first happened, I said, I can't teach my students lead and stuff no more like that, right? I have to get deep into what's currently going on. And so one of the things I did was we just created a neighborhood asset map where my students, we just over the couple of weeks, we just were compiling information, different organizations and mutual aid efforts that were going on in the city, particularly on the South Side. We put it together and just disseminated that information. We have to find out what our families need, right? Connect our families to different resources. We know for a fact that the administrations aren't going to do that. We know for a fact our mayors aren't going to do that. We know these things for a fact. So we have to be the ones taking on those struggles. We have to be organizing rent strikes, be in tune with if students are going to be evicted, what's going on with their families in that regard, be a part of food drop-offs, other mutual aid efforts. And we have to be immersed in struggle, right? So somebody said, right, cops out of schools. That's a big thing that's happening in Chicago, right? Getting police out of schools. In some areas, it's been having some traction. In some areas, it's been stalled. But also fighting for more resources. This is a time when, the bosses, they're scrambling, right? They're trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to go on the offensive, but they're also trying to figure out what's going on. So we have to see this as an opportunity for us to push limits. We have to see this as an opportunity for us to shake this system to its core as we are building towards a communist future and a communist society. So I think I'm kind of winding down and coming to a close. I think we have a comrade from LA who is also going to give some, talk about some of the things that have been going on out there.
The last one, right? Yeah, the last one. Leilani, as soon as she sees the M from McDonald's, she's like, chicken nuggets.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. All right. I apologize to start off. I'm kind of multitasking here. We have like a very big event today, working with the families of police murder that we've been supporting for about 9 months now. So I'm actually in a caravan with my 3 kids while I'm also doing this. So if it's too loud, Adam's gonna take over for me and kind of share. But I have been a high school teacher in Los Angeles at a school for about 5 years now, and I've been working with teachers and students at the school around ideas of fighting racism, especially over that time. So a pretty good foundation was laid. I have a pretty strong base at the school going into this crisis. So when schools closed back in March, the organization that runs the charter network that I work for had no plan, was just going to leave these kids with nothing. And my teacher friends and I just jumped into action, planning a way to connect with students, to check on them, to make sure that they have the things that they need, and to start providing them with some sort of education, even in the absence of schools being open. So about 6 weeks after that, the charter network finally decided to do something, but we had already had the ball rolling. So the students knew that they had teachers in their corner fighting for them, that put them and their families first in these times of crisis. So I think that's the first thing that happened that was pretty critical. Next was when George Floyd was killed, and the school had basically no response. And I was in motion with people actually in Minneapolis with the families that we've been working here. But we still managed to reach out to our students and organize Zoom calls with them to check in on how they're feeling, if they're out in protests, to go with them. And the students basically called out the administration administration at that point, both current students and alumni, for being racist, for continuing racist practices at the school. And this is like members of a social justice club that I run, and other young people who have been around the party over the years, to basically say, you know, you claim that we're a family, and you just continue to post work assignments on Google Classroom, and nobody's checking on us to see, like, are we getting hurt at these protests? Are we you know, experiencing trauma watching all the things that's going on in this world today? So again, the students knew like who was on their side. The families knew who was on their side fighting for them. And basically throughout the course of the summer, we continued to organize a group of about 10 teachers at my school, which represents about a third of our staff, along with about 15 current students and 10 alumni, kind of coordinated lots of different efforts across the summer that culminated in a couple of things. One of which was launching an attack against the administration at our school and the larger management of our charter network, and forcing them to basically respond to their inaction, and leaving students behind. And then the second thing was demanding that we have a social justice day to open up the school year. That basically the start of the school year wasn't going to be the same as every start of the school year, where it's like, oh, my name is blah, 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 and I'm going to be your teacher. No, we are an anti-racist school. We're going to fight to be an anti-racist school, and the students are going to lead that effort. So we were actually able to pull that off last week. And it was fabulous. There were 16 students that presented 3 workshops to the whole school. Race is not real. Racism is real. And what are we going to do about it? And it was fabulous. It was fabulous. So I guess for me, the main takeaway in that effort is just that as communists in these schools, we have to be fighting to change the culture. We have to be the ones fighting for an anti-racist culture in the school, because what the administration and the management of these schools are going to offer is words. They're going to call themselves anti-racist. They're going to say that they're going to be there for the students and their families, but we know that that's not actually going to happen. So we have to take their words and use it to organize real struggle and real fight back in these schools, empowering students so that they know that they can change this world if they join up with PLP in the future, having a revolution. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank y'all for being patient with all of the craziness here.
Thank you, Sabrina.
I think they're gonna.
Okay. That was amazing, an amazing note to end on. Like, we have to be working. Like, we have to be introducing these ideas at all times to everyone. We have to be the leaders in our communities in order for us to work towards the future that we want. With that, I want to get us into our Q&A section. Is everyone back on? For Angela. The first question that I wanted to pose to you all was one that, sorry, I'm trying to see who asked it. Okay. That Cheryl asked, that was, if we shouldn't be calling for schools to stay closed and we can't open them safely, what is the actual struggle we should be involved in around this? Like, what is the tactical slogan for the general public?
That's a great question. And, you know, I think that, like, for instance, when we get involved in these campaigns around police murder, we get involved in calling for all kinds of things. officers to be incarcerated, locked up. Sometimes families want the officers stripped of their badges. And so we know that none of those things are going to lead to communism. But we also know that we can't build communism if we're not in unity with people who are making these kinds of demands. So, you know, it would seem to me that Progressive Labor Party doesn't call for the incarceration of police or their conviction. You know, we call for communist revolution and for building the party. And so I think that if we are surrounded by workers who reject going back into school, then we have to be in that struggle. I think the thing that complicates it is that some of the workers, our co-workers as our teacher workers now, the leadership that they have provided from their unions has no history of being anti-racist. That's part of the problem in many, many places, or being pro-student in many, many, many places. There are some exceptions. Chicago would be the most noteworthy, which is still an incomplete example, right, of pro-student union leadership. But without going on and on, you know, more than that, I would definitely have to say that we have to be careful of movements to keep schools closed that are teacher only. That's something to look out for. We have to unite with parents and students. And if that's the call from the neighborhoods, then that's different than a call from, which is a negotiated call between the mayor and a teacher union president. We don't call that pro-working class. I hope that helps, because it's a great question.
Can you restate the question? I'm sorry, I was not logged in.
If we shouldn't be calling for schools to stay closed, and if we can't open them safely, what is the actual struggle we should be involved in around this? Should we try to seize the school building and have parents drop off their kids and try to do in-person lessons but spaced out, or what? That's from Cheryl. Angela, did you hear that?
I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, most of it.
So what are we working for if we're not working for schools to be open or schools to be closed? Like if both of those are if they both have these contradictions, then what is our slogan for the general public?
I don't know that a slogan works, except that the unity, what was it? Glenn, you were saying it quite a few times, you know, really under capitalism, the only thing we can do is rely on each other. My school district is closing, and it may be closed the entire year. It'll be closed at least until December, the entire district. So we all will be distance learning. And I think I keep hitting home the same thing that you're saying about going back. You know, kids are going to be home alone, unsupervised. Their parents are out working. The working class is out working. Their children are still in danger. They're not safe at home either. And we can't fool ourselves into thinking that the working class is safe in a capitalist system. From there, we're working on things like making sure kids get healthy food, not just the school lunches, but healthy food. We have one community we're working with on a rent strike. So they're organizing themselves, and we're getting involved in that to help them be free from paying rent. We have organizations raising money to get people money for medicine or money for other things that they need. We have a lot of people needing to go to ICE appointments. That's going to open up soon. So again, it goes back to whether we're in school or not, the only security we have is with each other. And that community has got to be built. And again, like Glenn also said the same thing. We have to really focus on our students, not the curriculum. I know they're rolling out all kinds of things that I'm supposed to be teaching. And a lot of it is really, sure, it could be useful, but it's not where kids' minds are at all. So, you know, like, I think it's exactly what Adam said, and this that Sabrina was doing in LA. all of those things, that's what we need to be doing, whether the schools are open, whether they're closed, or whether it's a hybrid model. Since they didn't shut it down, that's what we have to do.
Yeah, I think it's what the comrades have said. I mean, I think that we have to be very clear on when we hear certain demands, like very clear on where they're coming from. You know, are they coming from the working class, or are they coming from something that was negotiated at a table? I think those are the big things that I see as, you know, distinguishing each other. And then, yeah, I think we also have to kind of, you know, I think oftentimes we see ourselves as leaders on the job, but I think we also have to begin to see ourselves as leaders in our neighborhoods and in our communities as well. And, you know, I think the comrade from LA spoke to that. And I think the comrade in LA is putting that in practice right now as we're speaking, right? And other comrades talking about different rent strikes and things like that are happening. So, yeah, I think we have to see ourselves as leaders on our job, but also leaders in our communities, because, you know, I think as we saw with COVID, a lot of things came down to you know, just a very neighborhood basis, right?
Nice.
So did you have anything to add, or can I move on to the next question? Oh, she frozen? I'll move on. Okay. So the question was posed, and I think it connects to another question. What are the ways that we can collectively help with education specifically and spreading these ideas? And also, Maria asked, and I think these go together, what are ways that retired educators or other workers can be a part of the fight to empower students? But I also feel like what you all said before also ties into this.
Do you want to elaborate?
So what I would say is that all of these notions of like communicating with students, making sure that like we have these you guys have these calls with them, making sure that like we are constantly in contact with each other, making sure that we're all good, helps with education, because like these are the people that are doing this for you, and what are their politics? Like when you're sharing that, I think that is empowering as a student.
I mean, from retired teachers, educators, I for sure, I know that coming up with a sharp, politically relevant, you know, lesson is difficult work, and they're precious when you come up with them. So, you know, dig in your crates, find them, and pass them along to your city leadership. If there's something that you think, you know, the teenagers in New York City need to know right now, and this could be coming from, of course, public health side of things, not necessarily our teacher educators, but I do think that we should all view our comrades in education as a conduit for wisdom that's been built up, you know, inside our party and inside the working class. So, you know, please, you know, pat article, you know, etc. You know, pass them along. Greatest hits that would be very helpful. You know, perhaps we can put them in a paper. I mean, why not? You know, and move forward and think more about what it means to use the paper in the classroom. Is important too.
So another thing, just like the parents of these well-to-do families, so to speak, you know, they are heavily involved in their children's lives because they have that opportunity in one way themselves or a tutor. If there's any way to get involved in the local PTA and see if creating those, what are they called now, pods, but really helping parents help their kids. If it's a tutoring session for a bunch of kids 1 day a week, getting other people in your neighborhood who may not have kids to do some kind of Zoom lesson, Zoom tutoring session to help kids. I think that would be really a real practical way of helping.
I don't know where Glenn went, but the next question I want to pose is, how can we address fellow teachers and their anti-working class words, actions, and options? They feel that they are speaking from truth and experience. We say that they're speaking from conditioning from the ruling class to blame others in our class and not the source. Maria posed that question.
Well, honestly, we can speak honestly to our coworkers, and acknowledge the lose-lose situations that we had before COVID. Acknowledge that frustration is the natural response to being inside a school building where expendability is one of the main lessons. The kids absorb the stress, teachers absorb the stress, and so I think a large dose of empathy with the legitimate side of the grievances that our coworkers have is important. But then on the other side, a real re-education about the history of racism and et cetera in this country and how central it is important, because to deny, you always hear people talk about, one of my friends, says, when you hear teachers and principals and et cetera, and people in schools talking about tough love in Black schools, they're always a hell of a lot better at the tough than at the love. Being real with how racism will always emphasize the tough over the love, and that's the effect of racism. To have our coworkers understand that more fully and completely, I think, is very important, because I think a lot of people have the illusion that they're part of the solution just because they show up to work every day and try to, spread literacy or numeracy amongst their students, and that more is required of being an anti-racist than that. So look, it was sort of elementary, but Ibram Kendi's book on being anti-racist, which we need to review and challenge and talk about what's wrong with it. But that book is a decent start for talking about anti-racism with teachers. It's a well-known book, and it basically puts forward the position that if you're not challenging racist policies, then you're not an anti-racist. And so a lot of our coworkers will be satisfied to show up to work every day, and it would never occur to them what it would mean to challenge racist policies on the job. And that question and the unity we can build with people around that, I think, will get us closer to being able to have, that honest, confrontation with the bad ideas that many of them are guided by, so.
Glenn, did you have anything to add, or can I move on? Okay. This question is from Jay. Considering how segregated the schools are in the US, how can we build multiracial unity and fight back in the areas where we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really we have to, immerse ourselves in the different struggles that are happening, right? So I think part of that is getting involved in the different mutual aid efforts that are going on, that are still ongoing, right? I mean, in the midst of the uprising, I like many people forgot that there's still like a pandemic going on, right? There's still folks doing mutual aid work and stuff like that, right? And so, I think getting involved in that, I think when these different struggles happen, right? So right now here in Chicago, there's still a lot of different efforts. There's an effort around, they're trying to pollute an area on the southeast side, in a neighborhood called Little Village. Amazon is knocking down an old torn down factory that just like put all these toxins in the air. So I think we have to be involved in these different struggles, right? And I think through being involved in those struggles, I think we can put our line forward, put forward a line calling for multiracial unity. Another thing that happened in Chicago after the pandemic was that Chicago police got a lot of the Latin gangs to start just harassing and indiscriminately attacking Black workers, right? So Black workers, many of whom weren't even involved in gangs. And so, me and another comrade who's Black, who have, base members and folks who are friendly, who are in that neighborhood, they organized a rally to fight back against the racism there. And we showed up, right, to put forward, to help put forward a more multiracial line. So I think we have to be in the struggle. I think that's what it is, right? And I think, obviously we have to take the certain health precautions serious, right? We figure those things out as we're going, right? But I think we have to be immersed in struggle. We have to be immersed where folks are fighting back. We have to figure out how we can be a part of it. In some cases, there may be a caravan. For some comrades, it may be actually, boots on the ground. Other comrades, we'll figure those things out, but we have to be involved in struggle.
I think that as teachers, I think we really need to be well-versed in history and be able to talk about history beyond just black and white. One of the slides I didn't include was about there were, I think in a 10-year span, there were almost 600 lynchings of Mexicans who were Mexican or Mexican Americans on the US side of the border. And we don't talk about that. We don't read about that in history, right? But that happened. When they were lynched, they were labeled as white because they weren't Black. But then they also didn't get any of the, I guess, privileges, quote unquote, of being white because they were Mexican. And then, the racism the racist attack on the Chinese, right? That happened, right? That was the Mexican repatriation and then the Chinese being sent back, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And think about today, how the Chinese are getting attacked today, right? And it's not just white people who are attacking the Chinese, it's other people too, right? And that's part of what the capitalist system does. So I think if anytime we talk about anti-racism, we have to bring it back to what the capitalists are doing in order to divide us, why racism even exists, and be able to pull from history to explain to people again and again and again that the only answer is multiracial unity, and here's why. Because otherwise, I know everywhere around here, everything is about equity in education and learning about white supremacy and white fragility, and really, everyone's filled with self-flagellation. They're self-flagellating. But then when I talk about capitalism, then they tell me that I'm just fragile and I don't want to talk about racism because I'm too fragile. And they don't want to address capitalism. They don't want to address what's going on because of capitalism. But we need to know our history better than they do.
Another question I'm going to pose is kind of a pivot. This question is also from Jay. Yes, wait, sorry. Yeah, it's from Jay. And they asked, in what ways do we see the US bosses main wing trying to pivot attention more back to education to suit their long-term needs and build up to imperialist war?
That's a heavy one. I just talked a lot. It's someone else's turn.
Can you restate that question and then I'll take a swing?
Yes. Basically, in what ways do we see the US's main wing trying? I'm going to restate the question. In what ways do we see the US bosses main wing trying to pivot attention more back to education to suit their long-term needs and build up to imperialist war?
Now, I think one of the examples, to me at least, was when I saw the president of the AFT, I forget her first name, but Weingart, I want to say it's her last name, kind of put forward this, if teachers want to go on strike, we support it. I personally saw that as like, a real big, her being a person who, I remember going to AFT conventions years ago, and she was a president then, and Biden was like speaking, right? So clearly, in my opinion, they gang, right? They pretty close with each other. So that was one of those instances where I saw, okay, that there, obviously Trump is saying folks should go back into the schools and stuff like that. And, the main wing kind of getting the teachers unions, under control to kind of, pose this, I guess, counter. Because, I just thought it was interesting because she's, obviously I'm in CTU here. She ain't never supported no strike. We went on. So, right, for these same issues that now she's speaking about. So, that was one of those instances for me where I saw the main wing.
Or also like how is this conversation about education, surrounding education, connected to the war that the imperialists are trying to start?
Yeah. You want to jump in? I mean, that's a huge question for the working class, and that's part of what separates nationalists from internationalists. All right, and so because we are, a party and a movement of the international working class, then inter-imperialist war is the greatest it's a great focal point for us. The catastrophe for our class in that context is great, but also the opportunity, through the 20th century has shown that this is when there's the opportunity for workers to reject capitalism for real and make for real communist revolutions. And so, look, I think that part of getting the schools going has to do with the fact that U.S. it's been in trouble, since the 2008 crisis and sharply and before that, but certainly more since the 2008 financial crisis. And I guess I say that to say this: the U.S. model of society, of capitalist society, was a leading model of society for decades after World War II, and the schooling system that built up in the United States was part of that model. Mm-hmm. Particularly higher education, which was like viewed by the whole world as, oh, we want to go to college in the United States of America, right? That's still somewhat the case today. So the fact that U.S. capitalism can't get its schools back going, it's like a major sign that something is rotting and dying at the heart of the system. And so this is also why you don't just see Trump talking about going back to school. In fact, you see people like de Blasio and Cuomo, you know what I mean? Big time, main wing, U.S. ruling class Democratic leaders and figures also sort of heeding this same point that the New York Times made, which was that if New York schools can't go back, then nobody's going back. With the infection rates in New York City, if that city can't go back, then the nation is sort of shut down. And then the nation being shut down, there's a whole flare-up with Chinese imperialism looking at U.S. ruling class and seeing weakness. And so the risk of it spilling over into more of a conflict in the coming months is greater, because kick them when they're down. So we will see. I don't want to be alarmist and say it's some of the headlines now are that the Chinese are sort of pulling back. They're trying to pull back from their nationalism. That's fine. But the general trend is towards conflict between U.S. imperialism and Chinese imperialism. And the paralysis of American schooling is another sign of a rot in American capitalism. That who would want to follow this country? Who would want to follow this country with the most COVID cases, schools open? Who in the world is leaning U.S. capitalism's way? So, and to that extent, opening the schools is kind of like a battle in an inter-imperialist conflict. And do you think they're going to worry about New York City teachers and New York City black and brown kids when what's at stake in the Empire State, to some extent, is the empire itself? They don't call New York the Empire State for no reason. That's where Wall Street is. That's the empire. They got to get it going. It's not a game. And they will sacrifice us. Send us into schools. They will sacrifice us. The teachers, the teenagers have become nocturnal. You can't reach them. All right. It's a real challenge. And we as teachers, if we get up and go visit these kids in their home and knock on their door and be like, wake up, we may be told by our own principals that that's a violation of some kind of protocol, that as teachers, we're not supposed to get that close to the kids. And then we have to win lots of teachers and say, nah, F that. We have to be with our students and our families. And in a way that is pro-family, not like Kamala Harris, who called the cops and courts on parents in San Francisco, you know, when the kids were truant there. So we do have an opportunity to really distinguish ourselves and to show what communist politics look like, you know, in struggle, you know, against it. But it is in the context of war. That is what the stakes are. That's why the stakes are so high. They didn't sacrifice to send boys off to die in Vietnam. They won't hesitate to send people to sacrifice people. They haven't hesitated with COVID, and they won't hesitate with their schools. So we have to fight back, and we're well positioned to do so.
I want to pose one last question. This got the highest amount of votes. It's from Bill. During the struggle against apartheid from South Africa, and after the government shot and killed, striking 2 middle school students in Soweto, a 2-year strike began. The right wing said that the strike should end, that education must come before liberation. The left wing said the opposite, liberation before education, and that the struggle takes priority over formal schooling. Do we think students learn more from formal schooling or more from participation in collective struggle for a better world?
The formal education, I think, it's kind of a silly idea for the most part to start with. But as far as the struggle is the education, right? You can teach kids to learn. You can teach kids to read by using the right literature. We're teaching them to read in a very formal way, but we're not using very useful literature. So I don't know. Anybody else? I just think the struggle and the liberation, that is the education.
Oh, Adam, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Look, hey, you know what? See?
Hey.
I have help. I get kicked under the table, you know, to if I go off track, you know. So liberation before education. Yes, absolutely. Class struggle comes first. Practice is our greatest teacher, you know. And for that, we need unity with parents and our coworkers, because that's not why the bosses set these schools up. They didn't set these schools up so we could go in there and teach these kids how to become fighters. So it's clandestine to some extent. It just is, you know, and then it breaks out into the open when we have strength. So that's the agenda. That's the plan.
That
I concur.
That was our last question. Pat is right. Pat has been talking in the chat about how we should have a national campaign for teachers to be visiting their students. I agree. Thank you, all of you, so much for participating, for speaking, for learning with us. Thank you, everyone who came out. Like, this has been an amazing experience for me. And I'm so happy to be your moderator. The next part will be education under capitalism. That's what we talked about here. Education under communism. And we'll be sending out information about that when that is available. Thank you all again. People power, you know?
Yeah.
Bye-bye.